Normandy, June 1944. Inside the American tank, the first sound of battle is not an explosion. It is a voice, thin, distorted, calm under strain, cutting through the hum of the engine. Coordinates, warnings, acknowledgements. In the darkness of the turret, war arrives as information before it arrives as violence. The Sherman column moves forward through shattered hedgerows. German fire erupts suddenly, shells tearing into earth and steel. Yet the formation does not hesitate. One tank breaks hard. Another reverses without being told why. A third pivots and advances toward a flank no one can yet see. Orders travel faster than shock, faster than fear. Movement reshapes itself in seconds, not minutes, as if the machines are responding to a single shared impulse. Across the field, German crews face the same ambush with different tools. Their tanks are heavier, their guns longer, their armor thicker. But inside, coordination fractures. Flags rise from hatches. Commands are shouted into smoke and engine noise. Runners sprint between vehicles under fire. Information arrives late, or not at all. Each crew fights bravely, but alone, reacting to what it can see, guessing at what it cannot. The contrast is stark. The American Sherman looks unimpressive by comparison. Its gun is shorter, its armor thinner. Against German steel it appears outclassed. Yet it moves with purpose. It halts when others halt. It fires when others fire. It advances not as a solitary weapon, but as part of a living formation, each action shaped by voices carried through wires and air. What military planners once described on paper now materializes in mud and smoke. Coordination is no longer an abstract doctrine. It is visible. Decisions are not isolated acts of instinct, but collective responses, informed by shared awareness. Each tank knows more than its crew alone could ever see. Something unseen is shaping the fight, something neither measured in millimeters nor forged in steel. And as Normandy burns, that invisible advantage is already beginning to tilt the battlefield. From the moment it reached the front, the American M4 Sherman carried a reputation that clung stubbornly to its steel. It looked ordinary. Its lines were functional, almost plain. In a war increasingly defined by massive guns and imposing silhouettes, the Sherman inspired little awe. To many observers, it seemed like a compromise made visible, adequate but uninspiring. Criticism followed quickly. Its armor was thinner than that of its German counterparts. Its main gun appeared modest beside the long barrels of enemy tanks designed for distant, decisive kills. Veterans would later argue that on paper, the Sherman was outmatched before it ever fired a shot. Historians echoed the judgment, measuring survivability in millimeters and muzzle velocity, tallying advantages that did not favor the American machine. German propaganda seized the opportunity. The Sherman was depicted as disposable, a mass-produced symbol of industrial carelessness. Posters and reports suggested it was sent forward in waves, meant to be lost rather than protected. The narrative was simple and effective. Quantity over quality, steel wasted for speed. Inside the tank, crews coped with the reputation in their own way. They gave the Sherman nicknames, dark humor shaped by risk and repetition. Jokes circulated about burning fuel and thin walls, told quietly before battles and rarely after. Humor became a shield against fear, a way to acknowledge vulnerability without surrendering to it. By every traditional metric, the verdict seemed clear. In a direct duel, the Sherman should lose more often than it won. Heavier armor should prevail, larger guns should dominate. The logic of armored warfare appeared settled, written in steel and firepower. And yet the American advance did not stall. Sherman units kept moving, through Normandy's hedgerows, across broken roads, into towns still smoking from artillery. Losses were real, but momentum remained. Battles ended not in collapse, but in continuation. Somewhere between the statistics and the steel, another factor was at work. The explanation for the Sherman's persistence did not lie in its armor or its gun. It lay in something less visible, something critics rarely measured, and enemies were slow to recognize. By 1944, armoured warfare no longer unfolded at a measured pace. It collapsed time itself. Decisions that once took minutes were now demanded in seconds, often under fire, often without warning. A tank that hesitated became a target. A unit that paused lost the initiative. Survival depended not on strength alone, but on how quickly a force could understand what was happening and act on it. On these battlefields, reaction speed became the quiet currency of victory. The first crew to spot movement, the first commander to issue a correction, the first unit to adjust its angle or spacing often decided the outcome before a single decisive shot was fired. Firepower still mattered, but it arrived too late if information lagged behind reality. Radios changed the shape of this chaos. Inside American formations, the battlefield was no longer a series of isolated viewpoints. Reports moved continuously: enemy positions, damaged tracks, blocked roads, sudden openings. What one crew learned became knowledge shared across the unit. Confusion did not vanish, but it was organized, contained, and responded to. Crucially, commands no longer stopped at the lead tank. Instructions reached every vehicle at once. Adjustments were not relayed by gesture or guesswork, but spoken clearly, corrected instantly, acknowledged without delay. The formation behaved less like a column and more like a network, flexible, responsive, and aware of itself. This shift altered the nature of combat. Individual heroics still occurred, but they were no longer decisive on their own. Victory came from alignment rather than audacity. Crews were rewarded not for charging ahead blindly, but for staying connected, reporting accurately, and moving in concert with others they could not see. Information itself became a weapon. The speed at which it traveled determined the speed at which units maneuvered, concentrated fire, or disengaged. A tank that knew where not to go was often safer than one with thicker armor. A unit that understood the broader situation could avoid traps rather than survive them. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance began to shift. Battles were no longer decided solely by whose gun was larger or whose armor was thicker. They were decided by who could think faster under pressure, who could compress observation, decision, and action into a single fluid motion. The battlefield did not announce this change. There was no explosion to mark it. But with each coordinated movement and each shared warning, the war began to tilt, away from isolated strength and towards speed measured in seconds. Before the war was fought, it was first imagined. On drafting tables and in staff colleges, armored combat was reduced to measurements that could be drawn with a ruler. Thicker armor meant survival. Larger guns meant dominance. Victory, it was assumed, would belong to the machine that could endure the most punishment while delivering the heaviest blow. It was a logic that felt unassailable, clear, mechanical, and reassuringly concrete. German armored doctrine embraced this belief with confidence. Design philosophy gravitated toward firepower and protection, toward vehicles that could win the decisive duel. Tanks were built to dominate head-on encounters, to destroy the enemy before he could respond. Prestige followed weight. The battlefield, it was believed, would reward the strongest contender standing alone at the moment of contact. Across the Atlantic, American planners reached a different conclusion, but not by accident or ignorance. They understood the Sherman's limitations as clearly as its critics would later list them. They knew its armor would not always stop enemy rounds. They knew its gun would struggle at long range. These were not oversights. They were accepted constraints. Instead, American doctrine placed its faith elsewhere. Reliability mattered more than invulnerability. A tank that could travel long distances, start in cold weather, and be repaired quickly was considered more valuable than one that rarely broke down, but could not be replaced. Mass production was not a shortcut. It was a strategy. War, they believed, would be decided by systems that endured pressure over time. To critics, this approach looked like compromise. The Sherman appeared to embody everything it lacked, rather than what it enabled. But planners saw something different taking shape, an interconnected force designed to function even when individual parts failed. They were not building a champion. They were building an ecosystem. Within that system, radios were treated as essential equipment, not upgrades, not luxuries, standard. Every Sherman would carry one. Communication was not an accessory to combat. It was embedded into the design from the beginning. Crews were expected to talk constantly, to report, to adjust, to listen as much as they acted. At the time, few considered this remarkable. Radios were seen as practical tools, useful but unglamorous. Their value was administrative, not decisive. Armor thickness could be measured. Gun caliber could be compared. Communication, by contrast, was intangible, its effects difficult to quantify, its absence easy to overlook. Even among those who installed them, few grasped what radios would become once battle imposed its own logic. No one could yet see how shared awareness would alter tempo, or how speed of coordination would eclipse raw strength. The assumption remained that steel would decide everything in the end. That belief would not vanish overnight. It would have to be tested, under fire, under pressure, against an enemy still convinced that superiority was forged, not spoken. And only then would the quiet importance of those unseen connections begin to reveal itself. German armored doctrine entered the war with a clear image of how victory would look. It envisioned the decisive duel, one tank meeting another across open ground, steel against steel, the stronger machine proving its worth in a single final exchange. This idea carried weight not only in manuals, but in culture. Armor became a symbol of dominance, and combat a test of technical superiority. Tank versus tank combat evolved into a measure of prestige. Crews took pride in the size of their guns, the thickness of their armor, the reach of their fire. Design bureaus chased perfection. Refining machines meant to overmatch anything they faced head-on. Each new model promised control through strength, an assertion that the battlefield could be mastered through engineering alone. But these machines came with hidden costs. Heavier vehicles demanded more fuel, more maintenance, and more specialized parts. Bridges became obstacles. Roads became bottlenecks. Recovery vehicles struggled to keep pace. What looked formidable in isolation often strained the systems meant to support it. Power concentrated itself, but flexibility quietly diminished. Command structure mirrored this philosophy. Control flowed downward from centralized authority, designed to coordinate powerful assets deliberately and precisely. Orders were issued carefully, expected to be followed exactly. In theory, this ensured discipline and coherence. In practice, it introduced delay, especially when the situation shifted faster than headquarters could respond. Under pressure, communication gaps widened. Radios were fewer, less integrated, and often reserved for command rather than constant coordination. When lines broke or units dispersed, clarity suffered. Crews fought bravely, but with limited understanding of the broader fight unfolding beyond their narrow fields of view. Strength existed, but it was compartmentalized. The doctrine assumed that superiority meant control, that the best machine, properly commanded, would impose its will on the battlefield. Coordination was expected to follow naturally from dominance. If the enemy was weaker, he would react. If he reacted, he would be destroyed. The logic left little room for uncertainty, improvisation, or speed beyond firepower. This belief endured because it had once worked. Early victories reinforced it. Success validated design choices, and success is persuasive. But war has a way of changing its questions. What began as contests of strength increasingly became contests of tempo, of who could adapt faster when plans unraveled and visibility vanished. The myth of the perfect tank rested on the idea that control could be engineered into steel. It had not yet been forced to confront an enemy that valued coordination over dominance and speed of thought over weight of armor. That moment was coming, quietly at first, then all at once, when assumption would meet reality, and doctrine would be tested not by theory, but by time itself. American armored doctrine began from a less flattering assumption about war. It did not expect clarity. It assumed confusion, fear, and error would dominate the battlefield. Smoke would obscure landmarks. Maps would become unreliable. Orders would be misunderstood or arrive too late. Men, even well-trained ones, would hesitate. Planning did not attempt to eliminate these realities. It accepted them as permanent conditions. From that acceptance came a different kind of design. Radios were not treated as enhancements or specialist equipment. They were installed in every Sherman as standard, as essential as the engine or the gun. Communication was not something added later to refine performance. It was built in from the beginning, because without it, planners believed, performance would collapse under pressure. Training reflected the same logic. Crews were taught to speak constantly, not ceremoniously, not only when asked, but continuously. Position, movement, obstacles, enemy sightings, mechanical trouble, everything was meant to be reported. Silence was discouraged. The goal was not perfect discipline, but shared awareness. A unit that talked survived longer than one that waited for flawless orders. American armored units practiced rapid reporting and adjustment until it became instinctive. Crews learned to react to partial information, to correct mistakes quickly rather than avoid them entirely. When a tank misjudged ground or encountered unexpected resistance, the response was not isolation, but broadcast. Others adapted in real time, sometimes before the enemy understood what had changed. This approach altered the role of the tank itself. The Sherman was not designed to be a lone spear breaking through resistance by force of armor. It functioned as a node within a wider network, connected laterally to other tanks, upward to commanders, outward to infantry, artillery, and air support. Strength did not reside in the individual vehicle, but in how quickly it could contribute to the larger picture. Individual weakness, which doctrine assumed would always exist, was offset by collective awareness. A crew surprised by an ambush could warn others before being destroyed. A tank immobilized by terrain could redirect its unit around the danger. Losses still occurred, but their consequences were contained. Failure informed survival elsewhere. This system did not promise invulnerability. It did not pretend that better communication would stop shells or thicken armor. What it offered instead was resilience, the ability to absorb shock and continue functioning. When something went wrong, and something always did, the system bent rather than broke. In this way, American planners prepared not for the war they wanted, but for the one they expected. Their doctrine did not chase ideals of perfect execution or flawless machines. It was built for friction, for exhaustion, for fear. And in that acceptance lay its quiet strength. The Sherman, unremarkable on its own, became powerful when connected. Not because it eliminated chaos, but because it learned to move through it together. Inside the Sherman, there was little romance. The space was cramped, the air heavy with oil, sweat, and cordite. Engines roared inches from human bodies. Steel walls trapped heat in summer and cold in winter. Every movement was constrained. Every sound was amplified. Crews worked shoulder to shoulder, often bruised, often exhausted, performing complex tasks in a space never designed for comfort. Amid the noise and confinement, the radio emerged as the tank's most vital instrument. For the commander, it was not simply equipment, it was a lifeline. While periscopes offered narrow glimpses of the world outside, the radio provided something broader: context. Through it came fragments of the battlefield that no single crew could ever see alone. Situational updates flowed constantly. Enemy armor reported on the flank, infantry pinned down ahead, a road mined, a bridge intact. Messages arrived in quick, clipped phrases, often incomplete, but timely. Each transmission added another piece to a mental map that was never finished, only revised. Understanding did not come from clarity, but from accumulation. When contact was made, threats were shared instantly. A tank that spotted a muzzle flash did not face it alone. Others adjusted position before the enemy fired again. Smoke rounds were requested. Artillery was warned. What might have been a fatal surprise for one crew became a manageable problem for many. Time, measured in seconds, was bought with words. Inside the turret, smoke and fire were narrated in real time. A hit rattled the hull, tracks slipped, an engine coughed. Fear surged, sharp and physical. But even fear became information, reported, acknowledged, absorbed by the unit. Crews spoke through adrenaline, through shaking hands, because silence meant isolation, and isolation meant death. This constant exchange reshaped how decisions were made. Orders no longer traveled only from the top down. They moved sideways, between equals, from crew to crew. Initiative spread outward. A tank commander did not wait to be told what was already known elsewhere. He acted within a shared understanding, confident that others were doing the same. The result was not perfect coordination, but something more durable: adaptability. When one element faltered, another compensated. When a mistake occurred, it was corrected quickly, because it was visible to more than one mind. The unit thought collectively, imperfectly, but faster than any individual could alone. Inside the Sherman, innovation was not found in armor thickness or gun caliber. It was found in connection. The radio transformed fear into awareness, noise into meaning, chaos into something navigable. In that confined steel box, survival depended less on what the tank could endure, and more on what it could communicate. In earlier wars, lessons traveled slowly. Reports were written after battles, carried to headquarters, analyzed, and filed. By the time conclusions were drawn, the battlefield had already moved on. In Normandy, that delay vanished. After-action reports were no longer postponed until fighting ended. They were transmitted while the fighting was still unfolding. Crews spoke into their radios the moment contact broke. Ambushes were described while smoke still drifted over the ground. Terrain that trapped tanks in the morning was avoided by afternoon. What had gone wrong was shared as quickly as what had gone right. Experience stopped belonging to individuals and began circulating as common knowledge. This accelerated learning changed tactics at a pace the enemy struggled to match. Adjustments were not debated for months or tested in isolation. They emerged within days, sometimes within hours, refined through repetition under fire. A maneuver that failed once was not repeated blindly. It was corrected, adapted, or abandoned before it could become doctrine. Warnings traveled ahead of danger. Crews marked ambush points in words rather than ink. A bend in the road that hid an anti-tank gun became known across a unit before the next column reached it. Enemy habits, where they concealed guns, how they counterattacked, were observed and distributed until patterns emerged. The battlefield taught, and the lessons spread immediately. Radios also collapsed the distance between branches of the army. A tank commander no longer fought alone. Artillery could be called in within minutes, guided by voices on the ground. Air support was requested with coordinates spoken directly from the fight. Infantry and armor adjusted their movements together, informed by the same stream of information. What had once been separate arms now operated as parts of a single system. The battlefield became integrated, not perfectly, not smoothly, but effectively. Actions in one sector influenced decisions in another almost instantly. Strength was no longer concentrated at a single point, but distributed across connected units acting in concert. This integration accelerated adaptation. The enemy faced not just new machines, but a force that changed its behavior continuously. Every engagement fed the next. Mistakes were not hidden. They were exposed and corrected. Successes were not isolated. They were replicated. Over time, this difference compounded. One side learned linearly, bounded by hierarchy and delay. The other learned exponentially, driven by constant feedback. The advantage did not announce itself in a single battle or breakthrough. It accumulated quietly, measured in faster responses, fewer surprises, and decisions made just ahead of the enemy. The war was still brutal. Losses still mounted. But beneath the violence, a deeper shift was underway. The side that learned faster was beginning to control the tempo, and with it, the future shape of the fight. By mid-1944, the Sherman was rarely alone. It moved in packs, advancing not as isolated machines, but as interdependent elements of a larger whole. Tanks covered each other's blind spots, shared sight lines, and adjusted spacing instinctively. The formation was not rigid. It flexed and reshaped itself in response to what crews reported, not what maps predicted. In combat, roles emerged fluidly. One tank spotted movement through a gap in the hedgerow. Another maneuvered without waiting for instruction, already aware of the threat. A third brought its gun to bear, firing not because it saw the enemy first, but because it was told where to aim. Action unfolded as a sequence, each step dependent on shared awareness rather than individual initiative alone. This coordination extended beyond armor. Infantry moved alongside Shermans, their progress synchronized by constant communication. Tank commanders warned of machine gun nests. Infantry marked targets concealed from steel optics. Engineers cleared paths while artillery stood ready, guided by voices at the front. The force behaved less like separate branches and more like a single organism, each part compensating for the limits of the others. German units struggled to respond in kind. Individual crews fought skillfully, often with superior guns and thicker armor. But cohesion was harder to maintain. Delays in communication fractured responses. Counterattacks arrived piecemeal. Units that should have acted together engaged separately, their strength diluted by timing rather than destroyed by fire. In these encounters, superior guns were neutralized not by armor, but by sequence. A heavy tank brought into position too late found its flanks exposed. An ambush detected seconds earlier lost its advantage entirely. The decisive factor was not who fired the most powerful round, but who acted first, and who acted together. Firepower multiplied through coordination. A single Sherman firing alone posed limited threat. 3 Shermans communicating continuously could fix, flank, and overwhelm an enemy that outmatched them individually. Losses still occurred, but they were exchanged on terms chosen by those who moved in concert. This shift altered the meaning of lethality. Destruction no longer came solely from penetration or blast. It emerged from timing, arriving at the right place before the enemy could respond coherently. Communication made this possible. Words guided steel, awareness shaped movement, decisions traveled faster than shells. What German doctrine treated as supporting detail had become central to American practice. Coordination was no longer a byproduct of command. It was a weapon in its own right, one that did not appear on silhouettes or specification sheets, but determined outcomes all the same. As engagements repeated across Normandy, this pattern hardened into advantage. The battlefield began to favor those who could act as many while thinking as one, and with every coordinated advance, the cost of fighting alone grew higher. Normandy was never supposed to look like this. The bocage did not resemble the open terrain imagined in pre-war doctrine or training exercises. Thick hedgerows carved the land into narrow corridors, choking visibility and fragmenting movement. A tank could advance only a few yards before the world vanished behind earth and leaves. Every assumption about range, maneuver, and engagement dissolved inside that green maze. In the bocage, information became more valuable than firepower. A gun that could not see its target mattered less than a crew that knew where danger waited. German tanks, built for decisive duels at distance, found their advantages constrained by terrain that refused to cooperate. Sightlines vanished. Engagements began suddenly and at close range, where reaction mattered more than reach. For American units, this chaos tested everything they believed. The hedgerows swallowed formations. Columns broke apart. Ambushes appeared without warning. Yet the Shermans did not descend into isolation. Radios carried the fight beyond the limits of vision. Crews reported what they encountered as it happened: blocked lanes, hidden guns, enemy movement just beyond the next rise. What one tank learned did not die with it. Under fire, Sherman units remained aligned in ways that surprised even their commanders. Orders arrived quickly, often before confusion could harden into paralysis. Adjustments followed immediately. Tanks repositioned based on voices rather than sight. Infantry shifted in response to reports they could not yet confirm. The battlefield remained fragmented, but understanding did not. German counterattacks began to lose momentum in this environment. Striking forces assembled carefully, but once engaged, cohesion eroded. Communication delays compounded the problem. By the time orders filtered through smoke and terrain, American units had already adapted. Counterstrokes arrived late, striking positions that no longer existed or facing defenses already reinforced. The contrast grew sharper with each engagement. Where German units paused to re-establish control, American units pressed forward, imperfect but coordinated. Initiative no longer belonged to the side with the heavier gun. It belonged to the side that could decide faster in uncertainty. Radios shortened the distance between problem and response, collapsing delay into action. In the bocage, doctrine met reality. Armor thickness offered no protection against surprise. Firepower alone could not compensate for disorientation. What mattered was the ability to maintain coherence when visibility disappeared and plans unraveled. American units did not always know what lay ahead, but they knew more than the enemy believed possible. Gradually, the balance shifted, not through a single dramatic clash, but through accumulation. German defenses bent, then thinned. Counterattacks stalled. Positions were bypassed rather than battered. The hedgerows, once a shield, became a trap for those who could not coordinate within them. Then came the moment doctrine could no longer explain. American forces began to break free of the bocage. Gaps widened, roads opened, movement accelerated. What had been containment turned into pursuit. The breakout did not announce itself with a single order or thunderous assault. It emerged from countless small decisions made faster than the enemy could match. Normandy had broken the theory that strength alone decides battles. In its place stood a quieter truth, that under chaos, the side that communicates best seizes initiative. As the hedgerows fell behind them and open ground returned, American units carried that advantage forward, into a phase of the war defined not by resistance, but by momentum. And once momentum belongs to one side, it is rarely surrendered. Once the lines cracked, the nature of the war changed almost immediately. Breakthroughs were no longer pauses in the fighting, they were invitations to move. American units did not stop to consolidate or admire gains. They exploited them. Columns turned, advanced, and redeployed with a speed that surprised even those giving the orders. The emphasis shifted from holding ground to using it. Sherman units redeployed faster than German command could react. Radios allowed formations to pivot in near real time, responding to opportunities as they emerged rather than waiting for confirmation from above. A road found open was used immediately. A weak flank was pressed before it could be reinforced. Decisions followed momentum, not paperwork. This was maneuver warfare stripped of ceremony. Orders were short, adjustments constant. Units did not advance in straight lines but flowed through gaps, changing direction as information arrived. Radios made this possible. They carried reports forward and backward simultaneously, collapsing the delay that once separated discovery from action. Enemy strongpoints were no longer treated as obstacles demanding destruction. They were bypassed when possible, isolated when necessary. Firepower was conserved for moments that mattered. A position that could not see or communicate effectively was rendered irrelevant, even if it remained physically intact. The goal was not to crush resistance everywhere, but to deny it coherence anywhere. Heavy German tanks, formidable in isolation, struggled in this environment. Built to dominate frontal engagements, they found themselves outpaced and outmaneuvered. Flanks were exposed. Fuel ran short. Orders arrived too late. Once isolated, even the strongest machines became liabilities, immobile, visible, and increasingly irrelevant to the larger fight unfolding around them. As American units pushed forward, The battlefield stretched German control thin. Headquarters struggled to maintain awareness across widening fronts. Communication lagged behind movement. Local successes failed to translate into coordinated defense. The war accelerated beyond the limits of centralized command. Momentum compounded itself. Each successful advance created new opportunities faster than they could be countered. Shermans appeared where they were not expected, supported by infantry and artillery guided by constant communication. Resistance stiffened in places, but it no longer dictated tempo. The initiative had changed hands. This was the moment when thickness lost its primacy. Armor could not compensate for delay. Firepower could not recover lost time. The decisive factor was speed, not reckless speed, but informed speed, guided by shared awareness and rapid coordination. Radios turned movement into advantage, and advantage into inevitability. German doctrine had prepared for battles of strength. It now faced a war of motion. Control slipped not because courage failed, but because the environment demanded something different. The side that moved faster, learned faster, and decided faster began to dictate terms. By the time this became fully apparent, it was already too late to reverse. Momentum does not announce itself as irreversible. It simply continues, carrying one side forward while the other struggles to keep pace. And in the summer of 1944, that momentum was no longer balanced. Speed had replaced thickness, and the war, once contested yard by yard, was now unfolding in miles. Collapse rarely arrives with a single explosion. More often, it announces itself quietly, in missed messages, in unanswered calls, in orders that arrive too late to matter. Across German lines, reports began to repeat the same problem. Instructions delayed, routes unclear, authority fragmented. Units fought on, but increasingly without direction, reacting to events they could no longer shape. As pressure mounted, command structures strained and then fractured. Headquarters struggled to maintain contact with formations that were moving or retreating faster than expected. Lines were cut, radios fell silent. Decisions that once flowed downward now stalled in transit. Control did not vanish all at once. It thinned, stretched across distances it could no longer span. On the other side, American coordination tightened. Resistance weakened, but organization did not loosen. Sherman units advanced with growing confidence, not because danger had disappeared, but because awareness had increased. Radios synchronized movements across miles of front, aligning columns that never saw each other but moved as if they did. This synchronization reshaped the fight. Advances were timed rather than improvised. One unit pressed while another maneuvered. Gaps were exploited before they could close. Information flowed continuously. Enemy withdrawals, collapsing defenses, roads still open. The battlefield became transparent in ways German commanders could no longer match. Retreats began to unravel. What started as orderly withdrawal turned into confusion as units lost contact with one another. Without timely orders, movements overlapped or collided. Supplies went astray. Defensive lines failed to form. Fear spread not from firepower alone, but from uncertainty, of not knowing where friendly forces were or where the enemy might appear next. In this environment, information dominance became decisive. The side that understood the situation acted with confidence. The side that did not hesitated or moved blindly. Radios amplified this imbalance. American units did not need perfect intelligence. They needed enough, soon enough. German forces, deprived of coherence, found themselves always responding, never anticipating. The sound of collapse was not the roar of engines or the crash of artillery. It was the silence between transmissions, the unanswered call, the report that never reached its destination. War, once shaped by force, now turned on connectivity. As Allied forces pressed forward, tempo itself became a weapon. The pace of operations accelerated beyond German capacity to recover. Each lost hour compounded the next. Commanders could not slow the fight without losing it entirely. Momentum dictated terms, and momentum favored those who communicated. By late summer, the pattern was unmistakable. The battlefield no longer belonged to the side with the strongest positions, but to the side that controlled the flow of information. Movement followed knowledge. Action followed clarity. Resistance, once formidable, dissolved under speed it could not counter. The war's tempo had changed hands, and when tempo belongs to one side alone, collapse becomes not a possibility, but a process already underway. By the war's final year, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Across Europe, the Sherman had become the backbone of Allied armoured forces, not because it inspired fear on sight, but because it endured. It appeared everywhere, on shattered roads, in ruined towns, along rivers crossed under fire. Its presence was constant, reliable, and deeply unremarkable, and that was precisely its strength. The Sherman's technical shortcomings were well documented, even as the war was still being fought. Crews knew its limits intimately. They understood the risks of its armor, the constraints of its gun, the consequences of meeting heavier enemy tanks head-on. These weaknesses were not secrets. They were facts, accepted rather than denied. What was less visible and harder to measure was the advantage it carried inside. Communication did not announce itself with blast or recoil. It left no wreckage, yet it shaped every engagement. Radios allowed crews to share awareness beyond their own narrow viewports. Knowledge traveled faster than threat. Survival often depended not on what a crew could withstand, but on what it could avoid. As a result, crews survived longer. Warnings arrived before ambushes closed. Retreats were coordinated rather than panicked. Support was requested early, not after options vanished. Losses still occurred, but they were fewer than they might have been, because isolation was replaced by connection. Battles, increasingly, were not decided by duels between individual tanks. They were decided by coordination, by which side could bring the right force to the right place at the right time. Shermans rarely fought alone. They fixed enemies, flanked them, bypassed them, or drowned them in combined fire guided by shared information. Strength emerged not from dominance, but from alignment. Numbers amplified this effect. Each additional Sherman did not simply add another gun. It added another sensor, another voice, another point in the network. The system grew more resilient as it expanded. Losses were absorbed. Gaps were filled. The whole continued to function even as parts failed. Victory, in the end, did not emerge from a single superior machine. It emerged from design choices made long before Normandy, choices that prioritized communication, redundancy, and adaptability over perfection. The Sherman was not built to be the best tank on the battlefield. It was built to be part of a system that could win a war. In that sense, its ordinariness was its legacy. It demonstrated that modern warfare rewards not brilliance in isolation, but competence multiplied through connection. And by the time the guns fell silent, that lesson had reshaped not only how battles were fought, but how armies would be built in the decades to follow. The most profound change brought by the radio was not technical, it was cultural. Radios did more than transmit sound, they redistributed authority. Decisions no longer lived exclusively at the top of rigid hierarchies. They moved closer to the battlefield, into the hands of those who could see, hear, and feel the situation unfolding in real time. This shift quietly democratized decision-making. A tank commander no longer waited passively for instructions shaped far from the front. He reported, interpreted, and acted within a shared framework of intent. His judgment mattered, not as defiance, but as contribution. The system did not collapse under this freedom. It depended on it. Authority, once centralized and guarded, became conditional and mobile. Commanders still set objectives, but execution adapted continuously at lower levels. This was not chaos. It was trust, built on training, communication, and the expectation that individuals closest to danger often possessed the clearest understanding of it. Initiative, long treated with suspicion in many armies, was encouraged rather than punished. Mistakes were inevitable, but paralysis was worse. Crews learned that acting on imperfect information was preferable to waiting for perfect clarity that would never arrive. Radios made this possible by ensuring that action remained visible, shared, and correctable. Technology, in this sense, reflected a deeper belief about human judgment. The American system assumed that soldiers were capable of thinking under pressure, adapting under stress, and learning from failure. Radios amplified those qualities rather than replacing them. They did not automate decision-making, they enabled it. As a result, war itself began to change character. Battles were no longer contests between individual platforms or even formations alone. They became contests between networks, between systems of information, coordination, and response. The side that could sense faster, decide faster, and act faster gained an advantage that no single weapon could negate. This was not immediately obvious in victory parades or equipment lists. Radios did not produce iconic silhouettes. They did not inspire awe in the way heavy armor or large guns did. Their influence was subtle, cumulative, and easy to overlook, until it was absent. After the war, armies studied the lesson quietly. Not all embraced it fully. Some clung to centralized control, wary of decentralization's risks. Others leaned into the implications, reshaping doctrine around communication, flexibility, and initiative. The details varied, but the direction was clear. Information had become as decisive as firepower. Over time, communication ceased to be a support function. It became doctrine. Training emphasized connectivity. Command structures flattened. Planning accounted for uncertainty rather than denying it. The legacy of the Sherman's radios extended far beyond the tank itself, influencing how future wars would be organized, fought, and understood. What radios really changed was not just how orders moved, but how responsibility was shared. They transformed armies from collections of obedient units into adaptive systems, capable of absorbing shock, learning under fire, and continuing to function when plans unraveled. This was the quiet revolution hidden inside an ordinary machine. Not louder guns, not thicker armor, but a redefinition of how humans and technology work together under pressure. And once that balance shifted, it could not be reversed. The battlefield had learned a new language, one spoken not in steel alone, but in connection. History remembers the Sherman for what it lacked. It is often introduced through absence: armor that was thinner than its enemies, a gun that struggled at range, a silhouette that failed to inspire fear. Comparisons linger on what it could not do, on the machines that could outshoot it, outlast it, outshine it in a duel. The judgment feels intuitive. War, after all, has long been measured in steel. But armor thickness has never told the whole story. It offers comfort in numbers and certainty in diagrams, yet it captures only a fraction of how battles are actually decided. Wars are not won by specifications alone. They are won by how quickly understanding moves, by how fast a force can sense danger, adapt to change, and act before opportunity closes. In that deeper contest, the Sherman carried an advantage that did not show on blueprints. Radios transformed individual tanks into parts of a single thinking system. Information moved faster than fear. Decisions spread laterally instead of waiting to descend from above. What one crew learned became knowledge shared by many. The tank did not need to be exceptional on its own. It needed to be connected. This connection altered outcomes quietly but persistently. Ambushes failed because warnings arrived early. Losses were reduced because isolation was rare. Mistakes were corrected before they could cascade. The battlefield rewarded awareness over bravado, coordination over confrontation. Strength emerged not from perfection, but from alignment. Ordinary machines became extraordinary together. A lone Sherman was vulnerable. A network of Shermans, communicating constantly, became resilient. Numbers did more than add mass. They multiplied effectiveness. Each vehicle extended the reach of the others, forming a system that absorbed shock and continued to function even as parts were lost. The battlefield itself reinforced the lesson. Environments filled with uncertainty, hedgerows, cities, forests, favored those who could think collectively under pressure. The perfect machine mattered less than the adaptable force. Precision gave way to tempo. Control yielded to responsiveness. The side that connected faster endured longer. In this way, the Sherman challenged a deeper assumption about warfare. That dominance comes from superiority in form. That victory belongs to the strongest individual weapon. The war in Europe suggested otherwise. It showed that advantage could be engineered not into steel alone, but into relationships between crews, units, branches, and commands linked by constant communication. The lesson extended far beyond one tank or one war. Future conflicts would grow faster, more complex, and more fragmented. No single platform would ever see enough on its own. The need for connection would only increase. What the Sherman demonstrated was not a solution to a specific battlefield problem, but a principle. That speed of thought outweighs weight of armor. It is tempting to romanticize what looks powerful, to remember the machines that dominate photographs and parades. The Sherman resists that temptation. It forces a quieter conclusion. That war rewards not those who chase perfection, but those who design for reality. That resilience is more valuable than invincibility. That coordination, once achieved, is difficult to overcome. Steel was never the point. The Sherman looked ordinary, and in many ways it was. But what it carried inside, voices, trust, shared awareness, changed how wars are fought. And once that change took hold, the battlefield would never return to silence.